What will the economy look like 1 year from now? This is a question that our speakers and our panelists are doing. We have trying to address this challenge, having these amazing talks, these amazing debates. This is a question that we have to keep in mind because the road is relying on economy to try to surface this crisis. So trying to address trade, investment, finance is always a challenge, and that's why the Brazil-Africa Forum is here. I'd like to remind you once again that we have an online chat in our YouTube channel. You can interact with us, so let me check if we have some messages here. We have a message in Portuguese right now. Igor Carneiro, WFP Brasil, parabeniza a todos no Brasil-África Fórum 2020. Muito obrigada, Igor, pela mensagem. Vamos ver aqui outras mensagens. Amazing session. This message is regarding the South-South Cooperation Panel, so thank you very much. I'm sure that the speakers have received the message. Great interventions from Burkina Faso. Thank you very much for joining us. So keeping our eye back on the track for trade, investment, and finance for economic recovery, this is the theme of the session right now. And to moderate, I'm going to talk with Mr. Obi, President and CEO of the DelReeve Konsult Limited. Can I have Obi? Hi, Obi. So nice to talk to you.
Very nice to talk to you too.
How are you? Are you in New York, right?
Correct. I'm in New York, yes.
Obi, thank you very much for joining us. I know that the panelists are already settled up, so please feel free to take up the stage and conduct this amazing session.
Thank you very much, Caroline. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, depending on where you are joining us from. This session will be looking at rebuilding after the pandemic, trade, investment and finance for economic recovery. And the panelists are going to be looking at the question of economic recovery and promotion of growth, social development, safety nets, employability and consumption, rebuilding key sectors in the years to come, international trade, disruption, rearrangement of value chains, investment and finance as catalyzers of the recovery, and micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises. We have a very stellar panel with us today for this presentation, for this session, and there's no way I can do justice in trying to introduce them, but I'm just going to be very brief. You can find their details and their profiles on the website, but just so you know, we have with us today Lionel Zinsou, who is founder and managing partner of SouthBridge Group. Lionel, you're welcome. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you, Obi and SouthBridge. It's very honored to be a participant and supporter of this initiative.
Thank you very much. And next we have Carlos Lopez, who is professor at Nelson Mandela School of Governance, University of Cape Town. Carlos, you're welcome. Thank you.
My pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Obi.
Thank you. And also we have Claudia Prates, who is General Director of NDB Regional Office for the Americas. She's also joining us as well.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
And last but not the least is my former boss, Mr. Denya, Executive Vice President of the African Export-Import Bank. He is in charge of the finance, administration, and banking services in the bank. Dennis, you're welcome.
Thank you, Obi. It's a pleasure being here.
Thank you. So we are going to have 45 minutes of discussion, and then the last 15 minutes we go for question and answers from the audience. So if you have any questions, just go ahead and use the chat box and put them down. Caroline will collect them, and then we'll have question and answers later. But for now, I'm going to not waste more of your time. I'm going to start off right away with a question for Lionel. So we now have the pandemic hitting the world. So the question for you is, what do you think what sectors do you think offer the best potential for promoting economic recovery and promoting growth after the pandemic? And do you see any differences in the sectors in Africa and Brazil?
Thank you. I prefer that you have started by the potential and the opportunities. You could have started with the dramatic impact on some other sectors. But it doesn't mean, because they have been very much impacted, that they will not, in terms of recovery, remain important. You have in mind that the hospitality sector is in Africa, like in many or all countries in the world, one of the most hit and hurt by the pandemics. There are currently many assets which are in a distress situation in those sectors. But it will also mean that we will have a wave of consolidation there, from the airlines to the events industry and everything related to hospitality in Africa, which was a driver of growth before this pandemic, with each and every country having a plan to develop because of the social impact and the impact on the SMEs of those sectors, and because they are so necessary, if you take airlines, for instance, to the growth because of their very important externalities. So let's not write off those sectors. I think there will be a lot of M&A, a lot of consolidation, and they will recover. The truth is that if you compare to other continents, the governments have less financial means to support them through this crisis. So it means that there will be a major distraction in those sectors. But if you focus on the opportunities, some sectors are very clearly the priorities of the recovery, or having been less impacted, they keep the resources. If you take everything related to the major digital transformation in Africa, everything around the telecom, the mobile money, which has taken a role, which is an important social role for inclusiveness. If you take the way we have distributed some of the income transfers to the most vulnerable in selection of countries, it has been an important progress for mobile payments, for instance, in order just to access to the most vulnerable, because the governments would have had not any other efficient means. So everything related to the digital is obviously something which has been less impacted or not impacted at all, or even growing, and will continue and attract the proper financial resources. But I would say the same on the social infrastructures. After decades of focus on infrastructures of mobility, roads, harbors, and so on, and this will continue, but social infrastructures in terms of the health industry, with everything related, health services, health industry, clinics, hospitals, public hospitals, we will clearly have to attract, and we have in place some facilities, for instance, in the African Development Bank, with that defined as a clear priority. So social infrastructures, and I would include private involvement in education also. So the public goods will not be absent of the world after, because we have seen their limits. But clearly in terms of productive sector, I would say, and it is a similarity with Brazil, and we have a lot to learn from Brazil. Everything in the value chain of agriculture will be, I think, the first and foremost priority in the years to come, with serious comparative advantages in many countries. But it's not at the commodity level. Yes, it is important at the commodity level upstream to continue and develop the agriculture production, but it's far more in transforming. And I think it is for the Afreximbank, for instance, and for all the development bank, and even for a private bank like us, when we advise governments, when we enter in privatizations, when we enter in M&A, agriculture deserves its rank of number one as a contributor to the GDP in Africa. 25% average contribution to the GDP and 50% for the labor force, for the active population. But one of my first questions when I became in 2015 the prime minister of my country, Benin, in brackets, it was 1 year of politics in 30 years of finance, private finance. But during this year, my first question to the central bank governor was, what is the financing, consolidated financing of agriculture and the food chain in my country? He said it's 2% of credit to the economy. 2%. Today in Benin, it's 27% of GDP, 50% of the workforce. So you see the imbalance. And I think that we have the arable land. We have probably the new technologies applying to agriculture. We have no energy, no water, no financing. I mean, it's too simple to say that way. But imagine our agriculture, which is normally the number one consumer of energy, the number one of water, and which for instance, in Brazil, but in many countries of the world, which is a very, very important client of the financial system. To support agriculture, we have a bit of microfinance, and microfinance will be growing drastically. For instance, in West Africa, it's now directly refinanced by the central bank, which is totally new and open a large avenue. So you see, agriculture and the food chain and the logistic services added to the current progress we have made, for instance, for harbor. We have more and more modern harbor, essential for agriculture. We have not the roads, not the corridors yet to go to the last remotest farm and to save the crops and maximize the output. So I would say, if you have to retain one sector, because it's the number one client and the number one supplier of all the other sectors, manufacturing or value added, or logistics and services, and tomorrow the financial sector, I think it will be the priority. And there, in terms of technology, in terms of yield, I'm really, really convinced that we can benefit of Brazil. So more than the differences, I think it's the similarities which are very interesting. At a point in time in my career, I was the financial controller of a dairy company in Brazil, Danone, and great respect by what has been achieved by the private sector and the public sector with the help of the BNDES and so on. So I think we have to replicate this model and exchange the best practices.
Thank you very much, Lionel. I think you make a very important point there about the need to learn from the experience in Brazil. So on that note, let me turn to Carlos. We are looking at possibility of a vaccine being available at the earliest, by 2021. How do you think this will impact post-pandemic recovery, especially in Africa and the global South? And do you think it will affect how quickly it takes us to recover?
Well, Obi, what we have learned from this pandemic is a repeat of lessons that we should have learned before, yes, in a much more dramatic way. For instance, when we were struck by Ebola in Africa, we were very much taken by surprise in terms of the capacity of the affected countries not just the three most affected, which were Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea, but also a couple of other countries that could not really sustain the shock and had their economies completely shattered. Now, we know from that experience, but also from HIV/AIDS, that vaccines are promised immediately upon the outbreak of a pandemic, but then it takes a very long time to get them really at hand. Exactly. We still don't have a vaccine for HIV/AIDS. We still don't have a vaccine for Ebola, and I doubt that we are going to have a vaccine soon, despite the best efforts that are being made, including this consortia of funding that has been put together to have a response that has a universal impact. So I think it's wise to prepare for a much longer impact. A much longer impact means that even if the vaccine is available, it's not be distributed widely for a while, and then therefore we are going to live with these consequences of the pandemic for a while. And most likely we are going to have other pandemics in the future. So one thing that we have actually to include in our thinking is that low probability, which used to be used as a marker for low risk evaluation, low risk assessment, is no longer a valid proposition. Low probability can have a very high risk. And that changes completely the equation. Because if it is such a high risk, then we have to check whether the global governance that we have in sanitary terms, but also in economic terms, is at par with what we used to have in previous crises. And the answer is probably quite pessimistic. Which brings me to the issue of how it's going to impact Africa if we don't have a vaccine, if we don't have a recovery soon. Well, in fact, we had a number of systemic issues to address before COVID that are being exacerbated by COVID, as I mentioned. One of them is the way we deal with public debt. Public debt has become a worldwide problem, not an African problem. And for some reasons, you sort of box Africa to be stigmatized about the way it is handling that, because there are a couple of countries that have not managed it properly. And I think we have to correct that perception, but beyond correcting that perception, we have to deal with the way we do risk assessments, with the rating agencies' behavior. We have to deal with how we access development finance, and we have to put at the table the very critical issue of how you capitalize an economy. I mean, the access to capital has become quite prohibitive for African countries, which have the least access to credit and have the most needs. So much so that we are in a situation that countries that are supposed to be rich are actually the ones that are giving up on orthodoxy and are accessing concessional lending. It's not called like that, but that's what it is, because they are accessing credit with negative interest rates or the like, and therefore, and with almost without limit, for reasons that have to do with the way, we are dealing with global finance. Another issue is obviously the way we are going to handle logistics, because this crisis has demonstrated supply chains can be disrupted quite badly. And therefore, there is a need for most geographies to try to respond by creating synergies around them for essential goods. And that is going to be pharma, it's going to be agro goods. And I think Africa is going to learn its lesson and accelerate its free trade area, because it's going to be more imperative now than before the case for us creating regional value chains. And finally, the third lesson that I think it's quite interesting for us to learn is the fact that this crisis is going to come at a time where obviously we were already in a quite advanced technological path that is going also to be accelerated with artificial intelligence. That's why most of the companies that are in the digital corner are gaining value like there is almost a party. You know, they don't see any crisis. They see almost like there is a party. They are doubling their profits. It's just, you know, going up like crazy. And that includes, interestingly enough, companies in Africa that are growing very fast, e-commerce related business, for instance. And in the case of South Africa, you have the largest corporation in the continent, which is Naspers, that happens to have 31% shareholding of Tencent, the largest tech company in China. And as a result, you know, they don't know what to do with the money. They have so much money that they are buying back their shares because they don't have enough interesting projects to cope with. They have become the largest tech company in Europe. One of their arms, Prosus, is now the fourth largest company in Europe, and the first in tech. So you can see that it's a world that is not exactly the way we sometimes see. Even a company from the South, like Naspers, can be that powerful and can be making so much money out of this crisis. So we have to really balance some of our perceptions, address the systemic issues, and learn the lessons from the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Carlos. That's very interesting. You mentioned the need for synergy by geographies. So that kind of rolls back into Claudia's area, where I was going to ask her, you know, what role do you see economic blocs like the BRICS, the EU, and the AU playing to foster improved international trade in the post-pandemic era? And how do you think a country like Brazil should engage in this?
Thank you for your question, Obi. In fact, I'm not a trade, I don't work with trade finance, but I'll talk broadly about that. Yeah. And I think, in my opinion, the pandemic may reinforce the concept of multilateralism and improve cooperation among countries and regional economic blocs. The global dimension of COVID-19 pandemic is a result of a more integrated world, as well as the recovery from it should be. And so I think cooperation is the most important word in this world now on. The search for the vaccine is a demonstration of such revival on multilateralism beyond trade and commerce. We are seeing many vaccines being produced, being in test, and the cooperation among countries are happen. So this is very important. In the early days of the pandemic, if you do remember, many economic forecasts indicated that countries in which trade was based in commodities, as Brazil and also Africa, would suffer much more from the crisis. Recent data from Brazil, talking about Brazil, demonstrated that such forecasts were not very accurate. Brazilian commodities exports increased significantly during the pandemic, such as grains, minerals, and protein. This is a result of an early recovery from Asian countries and increased demand for food security. So I think that cooperation among countries is happening, and also let's say, it softened the crisis in Brazil. On the other hand, disruption change mentioned by Carlos was very evident during the pandemic, such as the health sector for supplies, equipment, and also medicines. Countries now may revise their industrial policies and, let's say, have an option for more local production in some areas, and also cooperation between the blocs. So this is a path among cooperation that I think it will happen a lot after the pandemic crisis. And also, developing economics may play a very important role, especially BRICS, that the extension of territory and also population. I think that will be a very important debate for development, and these countries will be in the center of it. So I think among countries, among blocs, cooperation is the word. And I think that will happen a lot after we finally could fight this crisis.
Thank you very much, Claudia. You harped on cooperation and the importance of that. So I'm going to move to Dennis and the issue of financing of the post-pandemic economic recovery. Obviously, this is going to require some new thinking from the development finance institutions, the MDBs, and the supranationals. So what would you recommend for ensuring capitalization of these institutions as we tackle the post-pandemic era? I think you're muted.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
I would like to agree with Claudia on the need for cooperation. Actually, you are seeing that on the continent, where through the Organization of African Union, the AU, countries are coming together to tackle not only the health consequences of the COVID-19, but the economic ones as well. And for multilateral organizations such as Afreximbank, who rely on governments for capital, it is quite important that we get capitalized to the extent that will enable us to deal with the issues that will arise. I mean, to give you an example, if you take the African Development Bank, their capitalization is around $200 billion. But apart from them, the likes of Afreximbank, AFC, Trade and Investment Development Bank, our capital levels are quite modest. Afreximbank, 3 billion, maybe TDB, 1.4 billion. Then you look at the existing trade finance gap, even before COVID, you are looking at upwards of $90 billion. So we do require capital in order to tackle the challenges of the post-COVID period. And I'm happy to note that the AU met in August and decided to capitalize the likes of Afreximbank to the tune of $2 billion. And the idea is that we will then leverage that $2 billion and provide funding of upwards of $5 billion to deal with the local manufacturing of medicines, of personal protective equipment, and invest in infrastructure that will enable African countries to trade amongst themselves. So we will need to raise funding and liquidity to support the AFCTA, which will come into force next year, to enable the African continent to realize the potential it has. And more importantly, what we need to invest in is manufacturing to add value to the commodities that we produce. At the moment, we rely heavily on export of commodities, be they oil and gas, agricultural commodities. You know, we have even have situations where macadamia nuts are exported to India for cleaning, for processing, and that can be done on the continent. And you encourage regional trade. Intra-Africa trade is no more than 16% currently. And with the implementation of the AFCTA, hopefully that will take us to 35% or more, create more jobs, create more wealth on the continent. But in order to do that, you need the borders to work well. Currently, we have over 100 borders on the continent and trucks that line up for weeks before crossing. It's very inefficient. So what are we doing as Afreximbank? We are working with the African Union to put in place interstate transit guarantees to enable trucks to move across borders without having to declare goods at each border post. And that is going to be useful. We are also now investing in infrastructure to enable payments for trade in local currencies, working with the Association of African Central Banks. We are working on a program called PAPS, the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System, which will allow African entrepreneurs to trade and receive payments in their own local currency, with Afreximbank acting as the clearing bank. But that's not enough. We need to be working with other multilateral institutions on the continent and off the continent. The South-South trade that my colleagues talked about is very important. We work with the Brazilians, we work with the Chinese, so that we can leverage funding onto the continent to develop trade, especially around infrastructure, which is critically lacking at the moment.
Thank you very much, Dennis. It's very nice that you also talked about the payment platform that Afreximbank is working on. May I ask what is the status of that platform at the moment?
Right now, we are doing the proof of concept with the WAMS region, the West African Monetary Union. Yeah. So the 6 countries there have signed up, and we are now rolling it out. As soon as we fully develop it there, then we roll it out across the continent. So the African Union actually adopted it as the payments infrastructure for the CTA.
Thank you very much. Going back to Carlos, let me ask you, what strategies would you recommend for economies to adopt in seeking post-pandemic economic recovery? Do you see a need for focus on micro, small, and medium enterprises?
Well, certainly. I think we have quite a significant job loss due to the pandemic, because the socioeconomic impact has been quite devastating, much more than the sanitary impact in Africa. And because of the characteristics of our economies, we are going to have a lingering effect that, in my view, is going to last the whole of 2021. That is because we will continue to experience volatility in the commodity markets, particularly with the commodities that are quite important for our export profile, like, for instance, oil, which represents close to 40% of our exports. But we have 35 countries in the high commodity dependence category. So that means we are deeply affected by commodity volatility. The second element is the fact that we don't have access to finance, as I was mentioning before, and that is going to be compounded by capital flight, because a lot of the investors are going to more congenial environments right now, and they fear what may happen in Africa with the heavy liquidity that is being introduced in some central and OECD countries' economies. They prefer to go to where there is shelter. So that is going to make a lot of capital flight that was already in existence increase. We have also the very difficult problem of logistics. As I was mentioning, supply chains are disrupting intra-Africa trade, but also coastal trade as much as international trade. So we can go on with the list, but basically these are very important structural problems that we are facing. Add to this a very difficult environmental year from an African perspective. We had droughts in many parts of Africa. Some are entering into their 4th year of drought. We had floods, including for the first time significant floods in the Nile, but also in parts of West Africa that normally are not prone to that type of floods. We have environmental stress in the Sahel that has been the result of a number of developments, including conflict related. So, and we had the locust invasion in the Horn of Africa, so twice this year, which is quite phenomenal. So you have quite a significant depressive environment for agriculture and for all the different value chains that depend on the weather patterns. Okay. And I think this is a second reason we should be very pessimistic. And of course, the third big problem is the confinements, lockdowns have created a difficult situation for informal trade. and also for small and medium scale business that are very much in between the informal trade and sort of the modern parts of the economy. So I think that we are going to have a very difficult year, 2020, and a very difficult 2021. Our recovery is going to be extremely slow. It's not going to be any V-shape, far from it. You know, we will be lucky if we have an L-shape that lasts 1 year. But this being said, what kind of response can we have? I think I'm quite encouraged by the capacity that African governments have demonstrated in terms of their resilience. They have put as much as they could. I think our central banks can do a bit more, but in general, the response has been a bit surprising, actually. And I think, in a way, we have put too much emphasis on the externalities, and we have not looked as much into the internal consumption. So if we find a way of resuming the patterns of internal consumption that have been responsible for most of our growth, we can have a more interesting future. Now, I think, to respond very clearly to your question, I think the policies that make sense are not the policies that stop at just responding to the short term, but the ones that use the short term. This crisis is too good to lose. Use the short term to actually do some structural changes. That includes, you know, some of the things that have been mentioned already in the panel, such as how we deal with pharma, how we deal with agro-processing, how we deal with a number of things that can be boosted by the continental free trade area and new regional value chains. But I think what is even more important is investing in the digital, investing in the youth of our population, which is married to this digital, making sure that we actually take advantage of the crisis also to go straight into a green industrialization, because renewables have become very cheap. That's the flip side of oil prices going down. We could have expected that because they are cheap, we can still remain with fossil fuels. But in fact, fossil fuels for us is more important as an export earning than it is to propel our industrialization. So we should go to renewables big time because it's very competitive. And one of the advantages of latecomers is to jump the queue and leapfrog.
Thank you very much, Carlos. That's very, very interesting. I'll go back to Lionel. The pandemic has had a very serious, significant impact on employment, on creating job losses. So what do you think that countries should be doing in terms of trying to stimulate employment and to boost consumption in the aftermath of the pandemic?
I think that we had a problem, a systemic problem before the pandemics, and it has been even accelerated. And it was the inability of the African economy to create enough jobs given the demographic growth. Clearly, we have a strange issue. If you take Brazil, you have a volatility of unemployment. When Brazil is in between 5 and 8% of growth in the last 20 years, you see the unemployment going down to 6%. When you are in the middle of a crisis, you can go up like now, up to 14%. But you have a volatility. Our problem is very strange. When we have an average long period growth of average 5%, say, for the continent, and even for countries like Ghana, Ivory Coast, Ethiopia, and so on, the ones beyond 6, 7%. If you take my country with an average of 4.5, but nowadays, just before pandemics, 6%, with a forecast which was 7% of growth for 2020, which will not happen. When you take those figures, in Brazil, it would command for the unemployment to fall If you were in the European Union, you would decrease in terms of unemployed people after having reached 1.2, 1.3% of growth. We are not unable to reduce unemployment even when we deliver on a regular basis 7, 8% of growth. Because we have a growth which is very capital intensive. Remember that we are not Brazil in terms of infrastructures, as Denis said. We have to invest in infrastructures which are very capital intensive and not labor intensive. Unfortunately, the sectors which are the most capital intensive are energy and agriculture. We need energy for a continent where 70% of the people have no access, proper access to energy, to electricity, to energy on all forms. So we need those investments. Same for water. Water is also capital intensive, and we have water stress in many countries. So our growth is focusing on very capital intensive and low labor intensity in terms of our absolutely needed investments. So we had this problem before. We have even more this problem today. And we have a second peculiarity if you compare the Brazilian economy and ours. Our informal sector is huge in terms of job creation, in terms of the total employment. In my country, the formal sector of the public authorities, administrations, and the modern, larger companies.
Yes.
It's 90%, 90. And even in parts of Africa, like North Africa, where it's lower, it remains in between 30 and 40% of the total workforce, the total employment. And clearly, if we have a priority today for the youth, if we want them to have an access to the market, because they are the victims, they and their families,
yes.
They are the victims clearly of this situation. If we want to try and create more jobs, we need a business model, a different business model, a different development model. We absolutely need to go down to some sectors where we have opportunities and which are more labor intensive, and yes. More importantly, for manufacturing. You say something which is counterintuitive. If you want to create $1 of value in the dairy industry, for instance, you spend $1 or $1.5 just upstream at the agriculture, at the farmer's level, in terms of capital, in terms of investment. And as we have no access to credit, whole credit, for instance, it is equity, okay? When you develop the value chain downstream, and when you make sophisticated products from the milk, given the value of the finished products, you have to spend 50 cents of dollar for creating $1 of sales of value. We absolutely, and I concur totally with Carlos on that and with Denis, we have absolutely to add value, which means to add labor, just to have a far less capital intensive economy. And to develop manufacturing, we cannot have an economy which is by and large, in terms of size, it's a bit more than Brazil, except that we are 1.3 billion inhabitants, okay? But in terms of GDP, we cannot fragment $2,500 billion. We cannot fragment them in 54 countries. We absolutely have to achieve and it has been signed, ratified, and so on by the majority of the countries. But we have absolutely to have a collective response. There is no employment issue resolved at the domestic local level. Even in Nigeria, the largest country, even in Egypt, even in South Africa, it is far too much below the critical mass. That's why trade is so important. And when Dennis was saying trade finance is not capitalized, it is an element of the response, a massive development change in terms of modeling.
Thank you very much. I think you hit it on the head there. We are almost out of time, but I think I want to go back to Dennis before we quickly run out, just because of the fact that Africa was on an economic trajectory, on an economic growth trajectory when the pandemic hit. The launching of the African Continental Free Trade Area was a manifestation of this growth and the recognition of the key role of intra-African trade. So how has the pandemic affected the growth, and what are the options for greater cross-border trade in Africa? What do you think, Dennis? Quickly.
Yeah, I know we've run out of time. Clearly, the pandemic has interfered with the rollout of the AfCFTA. It was meant to come into force in July of this year. It's been postponed to next year. But it has allowed, this time has allowed the member countries to, deal with some of the implementation issues. I was talking earlier about the payments and settlement system, which will come into play. And they're also working on the standards to harmonize the standards so that African countries can trade amongst themselves. When this pandemic struck, Afreximbank put in place a facility to deal with the pandemic, which we called Pandemic Mitigation Facility. We dispersed 3 billion in 2 months' time. By June, we dispersed 7 billion. That would not have been possible if the financial institutions and central banks on the continent did not contribute deposits to Afreximbank. Since we launched the Africa Mobilization Initiative, we've raised $15 billion from the continent to help with the financing of the trade. So I'm actually quite excited that when the African Continental Free Trade Agreement kicks in 2021, we will start to see growth in terms of intra-Africa trade, in infrastructure, even in terms of skills development. I think the point that was mentioned earlier about unemployment is that our education system is geared towards jobs of the past. We need to invest in creating young men and women who are capable of creating jobs of the future, the fourth industrial revolution that was being spoken about. Invest in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths education is very important, which will then enable people to do research. Research capacity on the continent is not yet where it should be, and we need to enable that. Sorry, we've run out of time.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me talk to Caroline to see how we are doing.
Thank you, Obi. Thank you, our panelists, for this amazing discussion. I'd like to address only one question, and then after that, you can say your final remarks. But this is a specific question addressed to Claudia from Vinicius Domingues. Claudia, he would like to know, considering the performance of NDB in Brazil, do you believe that we already have an optimistic scenario? Are there expectations for investment expansion in Brazil? And he is also congratulating you.
Thank you, Vinicius. How are you? Yes, we are expanding our loans in Brazil, and I think that until the end of the year, we should achieve $4 billion up to now. We are a bank with 5 years of existence. And yes, we have some 9 projects under analysis now, so it's a huge improvement. And I would like to take the advantage that's to say that in Brazil, we focus on small and medium companies for recovery. The government focused on that. The government put in place a fund to guarantee loans because we had a very big aversion of risk, and also despite of liquidity, the loans were not happening. And the fund is a success, and NDB is talking to the government to try to help to boost this fund. So it's very, very important, let's say, a path to go to recovery. So I think Brazil chose an important path to that. And we hope to continue financing infrastructure and also sustainable infrastructure. That is very important path, and also social infrastructure, as mentioned in this panel. Education and health system are on our mandate as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudia, for answering the question from the audience. I think, Obi, you can conduct now the final remarks, please. Okay, so it's now coming to the end, and I would just like you to have any final comments. I think we'll start with Lionel. Are you still there for the final comments? Any final comments before we round up?
Yes, I would like to mitigate a little bit the pessimism of Carlos. I mean, I think methodologically, it's very important to be pessimistic enough to not to be surprised by the next wave or the next pandemics. Yes. But having said that, Africa will be probably with Asia, the only two continents to be nearby minus between 0% and minus 3% in terms of GDP this year, which is compared to Brazil, which is around the same figures as Europe or the USA, is a sign of resilience and means that apart from Napster, which has been quoted, I think there are many areas where, for Brazilian interest, for instance, it's very interesting to participate in the opportunities of profitable growth in logistics, modern services, and agro value chain with value added.
Thank you very much, Lionel. Carlos, you have a response?
Well, it's hard for me to disagree with Lionel. So if there is a disagreement, it's certainly that I didn't express myself clearly enough, because we often are in the same page.
And no, we have never disagreement, Carlos. It's a question of mitigating a bit the perception.
No, I agree. The resilience has been demonstrated by the response capacity to COVID. In fact, if you read the specialized media like Financial Times, Economies, all these mainstream media outlets, they have been praising Africa for being capable of a response that nobody saw coming. And that is very encouraging, and basically demonstrates that sometimes the stigma that is associated with African agency is proven wrong many times, but it was proven wrong this time again. But this being said, I think it's going to be a tough recovery. That doesn't mean it's not also an opportunity, because in fact, this is the paradox. I think Africa may be suffering a lot from the pandemic, but if you look into the long term, what this pandemic has told us is that the three megatrends that count the most, demographics, climate, and technology, in one way or another, are going to favor Africa. Demographics, because we have seen pandemics affect older people, aged population. Africa has the youngest population in the world and is going to have it even more moving forward. Climate, because it is creating opportunities for leapfrogging and jumping. Even the talk about hydrogen is, the places that you can produce the best is actually the cross between deserts and sea, and Africa has plenty. And finally, technology, because technology, normally we associate it with value of the innovation, intellectual property, and it's very much the case in the immediate future that we can foresee. But if you look into the longer, it's about consumer markets and it's about consuming technology, which is going to be easier to absorb by younger population than older population.
Thank you very much, Carlos. So, Claudia, over to you for last comments.
Thank you, and good to know there's some optimistic from you guys. So I was a little bit worried because I'm a little bit optimistic. I think it will be very hard, but if the vaccine is approved and then we maybe at the second semester we can see like a recovery. We are waiting for that. And it's very important to say as well that Brazil is engaged, and I think that the policies here to maintain jobs and growth, I think they are very effective because we have a very important part of our society in the formal jobs that's in Africa. And we have the Corona voucher that we so call here for the more needed population that was a little bit very important in this time of pandemic, and also the funds for small and medium companies. I think with the continued growth of the concessions for infrastructure and the projects in infrastructure, as well as the investment in the industry area, I think that we should have a recovery next year. And we have some experience to exchange with Africa for sure. It was a pleasure for me to be in this panel, and I hope we have some other seminars to chat as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that optimism. I'll go now to Dennis for the final words.
Thanks, Obi. I'm actually quite encouraged that Africa has learned from the previous episodic shocks that we have gone through. And if you look at the response to this pandemic, the Africa CDC has done an excellent job. The African Union has led the recovery. So the countries are working well together. We as Afreximbank are going to host a trade fair for the continent, building on the momentum that we established in 2018 to support the Continental Free Trade Agreement. For the first time, African central banks, African financial institutions have the confidence of putting money in African financial institutions for the development of the continent. So we are no longer just tied to international capital markets to raise funding for the development of the continent. Yes, Africa is going into a recession for the first time in 25 years, but I believe that next year we will grow maybe by 3.5%, and there are resources on the continent to help us, achieve our development goals. It was a pleasure participating. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. It now remains for me to really express my appreciation and gratitude to each and every one of you. It has been a great pleasure moderating this panel. It's been very, very enlightening in terms of what has come out of it. And so I thank you, Lionel Zinsou. I thank you, Carlos Lopez. I thank you, Claudia Prates, and Dennis Denya. Thank you very much. And I'll send it back to Caroline.
Thank you very much, dear Obi and all the panelists, for this very fruitful debate. We hope you can still follow the Brazil-Africa Forum for tomorrow. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.